fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday, June 5th, 2018 edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. So glad to be here today. We have a lot we're going to get into. So much going on in the news, really. Nothing, major, no big, huge headline like a mass shooting or an economic collapse or the impeachment of President Trump or CNN's not telling the truth. There's nothing, huge going on.
Are you going to pardon yourself?
Yeah, I think that's funny. I think Trump's just trolling he's just trolling the media to see what kind of response they would, come back with. But, that's a legitimate question. We talked about it yesterday. Can the president pardon himself?
Folks, that's going to do it for us today on the Hagmann Show for Tuesday, June 5th. We are pardoning ourselves. Good night.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, buddy.
Well, we do have the issue of the Trump pardon, and there is, of course, the news media is freaking out, saying, the only reason Trump would need to pardon himself is because he's guilty. Here, let's take a quick listen to this if you want. This is from CNN, from the legal analyst Jeffrey Tobin, who says the following: Trump is obsessing over pardoning himself, means he has a guilty conscience. I guess we don't have to play the clip, but this is how the news media is spinning it, and what the president said was just, he threw it out there. Can I pardon myself? And if you remember, under the end of the Obama administration, we talked about the possibility of President Obama pardoning Hillary Clinton, and as well as possibly himself. But that never came to fruition. I wonder now, at least if Hillary wishes she got a pardon from the Obama White House before he left, but probably that would have drawn more suspicion to the story than anything else. But here we are, June 5th, the day the IG report was supposed to drop. Where is it? It's going to be delayed until next Monday, the 11th of June. As they are preparing testimony in front of, I think it's the Senate Judiciary Committee, but it was supposed to drop today, and they delayed it. They pushed it back. Not sure exactly what the reasons are. I'm sure we could find out, but that's one of the big things, we are waiting on, and it is a 500+ page report. And it details, apparently heavily, the misconduct by the FBI, specifically James Comey, Andrew McCabe, and others. So, do we want to wait till next Monday? I know a 500-page document is a lot. It's going to be a big read for a lot of people. Even for myself, who read documents like this all the time, it's going to be a big read. We're probably going to have to section it off at first, John. Everybody takes 100 pages, and then we go from there. But in all seriousness, I'm very interested to see what, if anything, is actionable in this IG report.
Is one of us supposed – okay, wait a second. I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. Is one of us supposed to say TikTok right now or to follow the plan?
No, that's like a Hannity or a Q thing. We don't do that here.
Perfect. Joe, just something that's kind of curious, and I'll make this brief, but I think it's an interesting little piece of context. Today and tomorrow, and the reason I frame it that way is because it happened right after midnight, so it's really June 5th, 6th.
You talking about the anniversary
of RFK. And the reason I bring it up is because when we talk about a president pardoning himself or a presidential pardon of anyone else, there's a very interesting chain of command that framed our world today. And I can do this really quickly. President Kennedy was killed in November of 1963, which made President Johnson the president of the United States, who there is white paper documentation was not going to be on the 1964 ticket. In fact, he might have been in jail, but that's a different story for another time. Johnson becomes president, but then in 1968, he announces that not only will he not run for the presidency, but he will not accept the Democratic Party nomination. So you've got Eugene McCarthy, you've got Hubert Humphrey, and you've got a latecomer, Robert Kennedy. Now, there's an interesting supposition out there that and then, of course, what happened was Richard Nixon won. The Democrats went through their primaries, and ultimately Nixon won the presidency. Now, what happened with Nixon? He had to resign in disgrace. Gerald Ford was placed in office. Gerald Ford, who had never been voted for anything but a congressman. He'd never been vice president. He'd never been in the executive branch. He was a congressman from Michigan. He finds himself in the White House, placed there, if you will, and the first thing he does is turn around and pardon Richard Nixon. So when you look at this chain of command, Joe, from John F. Kennedy all the way to the 1976 election between Carter and Ford, you can kind of make an argument from 63 all the way to 76 that the deep state was actually maneuvering all of their puppets into the White House, one after another after another. Do you follow my train of thought?
Oh, absolutely. And I got a book pretty much within arm's reach. I think it's up here. It's called The Globalization Syndrome, and it details exactly what you just talked about, what globalist agendas were able to be carried out under which presidents since John Kennedy. And it is, one of the most tragic, I would say, probably the most tragic political story in, I don't want to say, I'll say in the last, 300 years, seeing President John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic to become president, one of the last true presidents, get assassinated in such a brutal way, and then his brother, on the night he wins the California primary, himself gets blown away. Just such a horrible. And then you've got throw Martin Luther King in there. He was assassinated between
3
JFK.
weeks earlier.
Right.
They got rid of him right before.
Could you imagine living through that?
No, well, okay, let's go out even on a thinner limb. And normally this would be pretty un-PC, but I think within what we're doing right now, it makes sense. Imagine being an African-American young man at that time, Joe. It's been a couple years since the assassination of Malcolm X, but Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis about three and a half weeks before Robert Kennedy is then gunned down at the Ambassador in L.A. And by the way, I've stood. I know you've been to Dealey Plaza, as have I. I've also been at the exact spot where Kennedy was gunned down. I did a photo shoot for Virgin Records for a Nika Costa album back in the early 2000s at the Ambassador. And so when you go through that little door behind the ballroom, the door's right on the middle of the dais. When you go through that little door, you begin to go through this serpentine avenue of back kitchen pantry areas, and it's really kind of creepy. There's like this old electromechanical ice machine that looks like something you'd find in a 1900s psych ward, and it's really a very creepy place. But what doesn't make sense about it, Joe, is that he was en route. You see, the original argument was he was going to take the freight elevator down through the parking lot and exit the Ambassador kind of through the VIP, method. But that's not true. He was actually going to oppress her in the Colonial Room. And if you've ever been to the Ambassador, which now you can't because they knocked it down several years ago, but the most direct route to the Colonial Room where the press conference was is literally like, I would say, 20 yards from that dais. Like all he needed to do was walk off the stage right side or left side of the dais and walk right down a little hall He could have glad-handed all the people, and he would have been right where he needed to be for the press conference. So the reason I'm bringing all this up, because this is big. It's not the 47th or the 53rd. This is the 50th anniversary. It happened when we get to midnight tonight. That's when it happened. But so much of the original arguments that when I was in high school and in college, we bought hook, line, and sinker, they've been proven to be absolutely not true. And the other thing they said at the time is, well, Robert Kennedy was tired. He'd been campaigning, and he needed to go through the VIP exit to literally, Joe, it's like saying, well, you can go 20 yards over here to the press room, or you can go through an enormous kitchen. Think of that big Steadicam scene in Goodfellas when they go through that huge kitchen and wind up on the nightclub floor. It's that serpentine. And Kennedy had not been campaigning all day that day. You know where he had been all day on June 5th, 50 years ago today? This is going to kill you. He had been at the director of the Manchurian candidate's home in Malibu, hanging out by the beach all day, relaxing after heavy days of campaigning on June 2nd,
Wow.
3rd, and 4th.
Wow, that's pretty incredible that, the Manchurian Candidate, for those who are unfamiliar, is a movie about a brainwashed or programmed soldier who is programmed to assassinate a leader, a president, a senator, and they are triggered by some keyword or some phrase or something like that. And then they will be activated, and then they go carry out their mission. And there's actually 2 movies on it. I like the newer one better. A lot of people like the older one, the original, a lot better. But, I wonder how, John, what do you think happened? I watched a documentary the other day, and they said that he was shot in the back. He wasn't even shot in the front where Sirhan had the gun.
Yep. I'm glad you asked this question, and we might as well unpack this today. It's a slow news day, and again, this is for those joining kind of in progress here. This is the 50th year anniversary of the assassination of one of the last great members of American Camelot. So here's what happened. There are a couple of massive inconsistencies. There are 3 or 4 things that really bother me about the story, and they're simply this. Number one, Sirhan was carrying I believe it was either an 8 or 10 shot 22 revolver, firing 22 long rifle rim-fired cartridge. I think most of our listeners are familiar with that little teeny tiny round. But the bullet that killed him he had powder burns on the back of his head, and it was a larger caliber entry wound than a 22 would make. The security guard, who was not part of police, there was no, imagine this, Joe, 1968, Democratic primary. This man is going to the general election. There's no question about it. Eugene McCarthy is done. Kennedy's got him beat in the Vietnam peace movement. Hubert Humphrey's done. Hubert Humphrey he's getting votes that are being counted in the hundreds, not even thousands. So he's going nowhere, even though he would be the incumbent vice president. And there was a security guard who, get this, worked for Lockheed Martin. And he was moonlighting. So right there, you got the military-industrial complex directly tied to this. A security guard working for Lockheed Martin was the only other person in the room who was armed with what? With a .38 caliber revolver, which matches the forensics of the powder burns on the back of Robert Kennedy's head and the size of the entry wound. You can look at the optics. People can go do a search right now. You can see both some real shaky 8mm or 16mm movie and still photos. And Sirhan was never behind Robert Kennedy, not for a single second. He was in front of him the entire time. 2 other things. One is evidentiary. The other one is conspiracy. As far as evidence goes, the Los Angeles Police Department managed to lose. Imagine this. They lost a door jamb and a door that was part of the kitchen structure in that well, they call it a pantry, but it was more of an industrial dishwashing ice machine kind of area. The door and the door jamb were being transported, Joe, to FBI headquarters in D.C. and that it somehow got lost en route. This is an active New York senator, a Kennedy no less, the former Attorney General of the United States, who used to run the Department of Justice. He's dead in Los Angeles, and we're supposed to believe that these fumble-bumble idiots they didn't lose a glove or a bullet casing. They lost a door and a door jamb en route to Washington. Last thing, and this is conspiratorial, but I have a problem with it. The police conveniently found, and I've actually been by this house because it wasn't too far from where I lived in Pasadena, Joe. But Sirhan lived with his family in a little single-story bungalow-style house in Pasadena, California. Front and center on his desk when the police arrive, the following day, Robert Kennedy dies. They don't know who Sirhan is because he's so out of it hypnotically. He's not telling anybody anything. He's just sitting there like a catatonic state. His brother sees a picture of the perpetrator on the news, and he goes to Pasadena police and says, "That is my brother, Sirhan." The police come to the family's home, and right there, front and center on the desk, kind of like finding that terrorist passport on 9/11. Right there is a notebook that's got all this crazy automatic writing in it, and it says, "Must kill Kennedy." You can see pictures of the notebook if you do a search online. Joe, I don't know what happened that night. I know we lost what could have been a great moment for America. Let me ask you a question. We can move on if you like, but when you look at John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, two-part question. Number one, do you think that they would be more like populist candidates or even moderate Republican candidates today? And then question number two, knowing what you know about those men, would you vote for them?
That's a great question. I definitely would have voted for John F. Kennedy. I don't know that much about Robert Kennedy. I actually have a clip here. We're going to play this from 2 days ago. This is from CBS Los Angeles. It's 2 minutes and 14 seconds. RFK's legacy remembered 50 years after the assassination. So let's take a listen to this real quick and see what this has to say.
Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated 50 years ago at the former Ambassador Hotel in L.A. after winning the California presidential primary. KCAL 9's Jeff Nguyen tells us state and local leaders gathered today with those who knew Kennedy well to discuss his life and legacy.
Over here. Yoshio Niwa carried the magazine that pictured him with Robert F. Kennedy to the grounds where Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. Kennedy was shot 3 times at the Ambassador Hotel after winning the California presidential primary. Sirhan was convicted of the shooting. Niwa was one of the people who held him down for police.
We pull him onto the steam table, which is we keep the party food hot.
He touched people.
Civil rights leader Dolores Huerta is in this picture on stage with Kennedy before the shooting. She says RFK inspired her generation to give their time to social justice.
That they get involved, that they really see what's happening in the political world and that they assess themselves.
Today, the site where the ambassador once stood is now the Robert F. Kennedy Community Schools, where people who worked on his presidential campaign remembered Kennedy this weekend.
Appreciation to Paul Schrade.
Paul Schrade was one of the 5 people who was also struck by gunfire.
We need good schools, we need good housing, we need good food, decent educations for kids, and that's what he was all about.
The campus includes a replica of the famed Coconut Grove. There are artifacts from the past, including these campaign buttons.
Now it's on to Chicago.
Those who worked with Kennedy say he treated everyone with respect, including a cook at the Ambassador who met him for the first time on that fateful day.
I met him and he said hi, we shook a hand. I was shocked.
Kennedy is often remembered for his last words after he was shot. Instead of being worried for himself, in his final moments, he asked, "Is everyone okay?" In Koreatown, Jeff Nguyen, KCAL 9 News.
All right, that was an interesting report. Obviously, they have to, take the social justice warrior and, transpose it over to RFK. Whether he was or wasn't, he definitely was an agent of change, but not necessarily the kind of change that we are seeing today in the way it's being pushed in our time. I don't think either Kennedy would agree with that, because it goes against common sense. It goes against the norms of this country. It goes against so much. So aside from that part, I agreed with the rest of what was said.
You know, Joe, here's one other interesting thing to consider as we commemorate here on the Hagmann Daily Show, the 50-year commemoration. I hesitate to call it an anniversary, the 50-year commemoration of the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Remember that it was during the Kennedy administration, 1961-3, that John Kennedy, and to a lesser extent Robert Kennedy, his attorney general at the time, but we need to remember Robert Kennedy was John Kennedy's campaign manager. He was the architect of putting JFK in office. Remember, Joe, they sent the first 500, 1,000, 1,500 military advisors to train the ARVN, the South Vietnamese forces. So Robert Kennedy really wanted to stop the Vietnam War. Was it a social justice warrior thing? I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of that in RFK. I think he would have been a lot more diplomatic and mature about the social changes he wanted to make. I don't think that you would have found RFK saddling up to Antifa.
Right.
But he felt a deep compulsion to end the Vietnam War. He saw through the deep state narrative. And he also had a personal motivation, because it was his brother and he who sent the first armed boots on the ground to Vietnam.
Yeah, and we saw what happened with the Henry Kissinger State Department and how they really got so many U.S. citizens and others murdered due to the bombing of Laos and other expanding that war where it didn't need to be expanded. And the thing about John F. Kennedy is I always just not assumed, but all the reasonable evidence I could understand led me to believe that he was killed by forces inside the government. Now, I still think that is true, but since we've had some guests on our shows, and they've talked about this from different perspectives, I wonder if at all how much influence the mafia actually had on the Kennedy assassination. But again, I think it was completely the government, the CIA, the Dulles, the Bush. I don't believe it was the mafia, but I don't know. And then RFK, obviously, as you said, the guy who was blamed, Sirhan, had a gun that fired only so many shots, but there was 10 plus more shots found that were 13. Fired. 13. Yeah. So I mean, the whole story is just crazy to me. And I was looking I found a copy of the autopsy last week, RFK's autopsy, but it won't give you the sheet with the drawing of the body on it to show you where the wounds are.
This is the same coroner that many believe botched the postmortem on Marilyn Monroe. And when you look at I read the biography of former LAPD police chief Daryl Gates. I read it back in like 2003 or 4 maybe. And he had an interesting insight into the Kennedy assassination. And it drives me nuts when intelligent people just automatically go with the front page of the New York Times, LA Times narrative, especially when there's so many legitimate questions, be it regarding either Kennedy. But the LAPD had a lot of problems at that time. It was considered a fairly corrupt police force. And Joe, I think if you want to segue off of this and talk briefly about our show last night, one must ask oneself, a lot of times when you look at situations like this terrible loss of people like Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X was a little bit more straightforward of a murder investigation. By the way, that perpetrator is still alive. I don't think a lot of people realize the guy that killed Malcolm X is still alive, and he's no longer incarcerated. He got out a couple years ago, as crazy as that sounds. But when you look at these things, generally speaking, if it's local law enforcement, remember the feds took over the JFK thing, but the LAPD under the state of California dealt with RFK. When you look at these things and you see all these questions and it appears that nobody did their job correctly, There's no security, no police presence. Somehow the big evidence that would show the additional shots fired in the door and the door jamb, somehow that disappears. And you're missing the primary document. Like the first page an investigator is going to go to in a coroner's report is the page that's missing. You can't square that these people are all just a bunch of ignorant idiots that are incompetents. That doesn't square. It's got to be a situation where somebody at the top is in a big fat CYA.
Yeah, no, I mean, from losing, the Hillary Clinton emails to JFK's brain to it just doesn't happen. And this is unfortunately the same MO they use every time. And just like you said with the with 9/11,
I'm sorry, Joe. JFK's brain is missing, and yet we have guests that come on the Hagmann Report who believe the mainline narrative. I'm sorry, Joe. I interrupted you. I apologize, but I mean, come on, people.
Well, no, and you said it earlier, like 9/11. There was not a passport found in when thousands of human beings were crushed and pulverized to bits so small that they could not even be identified through DNA. There's no way a passport made it untouched, unscathed into the ashes on the ground. It just isn't possible. But again, this is the line of crap that they want to tell us. Just like Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. They want us to believe that it crashed nose first into the ground, even though there was not one piece of evidence that I saw to verify that claim. I don't know.
Okay, now that's an excellent point. Flight 93, that gave George W. Bush his famous soundbite. We're going to go get Iraq. Let's roll. And I believe he was quoting Todd Beeman, one of the passengers that purportedly overtook the hijackers on Flight 93. Remember, he held up that badge and said, let's roll. And the Congress stood up and applauded and went crazy. And what did we do? We launched another undeclared war. And this ties directly back into the Kennedy story. The Kennedys did not want Vietnam, but the military-industrial complex, Boeing, General Electric, Lockheed Martin, they did want the Vietnam War. I don't know if listeners know this, but we dropped more bombs on Hanoi alone, the capital of North Vietnam, now the capital of Vietnam in total. We dropped more bombs on Hanoi, Joe, than we dropped in every previous war up to that point combined. Imagine that. All the bombing we did over Germany and Japan, all the bombs in World War I. We dropped more bombs on one city in Vietnam, and those bombs cost an enormous truckload of taxpayer dollars. We're trained to follow the money. Well, there's your money trail right there. These companies, and I mean, Lockheed Martin, the Skunk Works, Boeing, and all of these massive military-industrial, and of course now it's all the IT companies too. Joe, they make billions of dollars. But you know what happens to guys like you and I and a lot of our listeners? We go over to these places banging the drum and waving the flag, and what happens is we get killed.
Well, yeah. Look at Pat Tillman. He was an NFL all-star who gave all that up to go fight in Afghanistan. And as he was exposing what they were really protecting in Afghanistan, that being the transfer of heroin back to the United States, he was mysteriously shot by friendly fire that they tried to cover up as some kind of enemy combat at first, but they couldn't hide it anymore. And the truth came out that he was killed by friendly fire, and it was any accident. One of the guys there in the Army who had a voice and a reach large enough to make national headlines with this revelation that all they were doing over there was protecting the opium. And what a coincidence. As soon as he starts to talk about it, as soon as he starts to write letters home about it, boom, back of the head.
Well, now, okay, hold on a second, Joe. Now, I think you're going a little far here with Tillman, because look, if we had an opiate crisis today, then I think what you said would actually, have some merit.
Yeah. Well, you're right, John. So
you nailed it with Tillman. I read his biography as well, and that was a tough book to get through. Pat Tillman, he left a lucrative career, 2 seasons with the Arizona Cardinals. I think, if I remember correctly, I think he was either a strong safety or a linebacker, but he played wicked defense. I remember that.
He was a safety, yeah.
This is what you've got. Yeah, he was a safety. Thank you. This is, again, from reading his biography. they tried to blame it on the Taliban at first, but it ultimately came out, they couldn't hide the forensics, that he had been everybody remembers Pat Tillman was like this squared, lantern jawed guy. The guy could have been a big A-list movie actor in Hollywood if he wanted to. His face, he was hit with so many bullets from a .240 saw, from a squad automatic weapon, that his comrades that were there went on record later saying that his head looked like a deflated balloon, and his face just looked like a mask that had no head behind it. That's what they did to this man. And the other really sad thing is that the guy who was operating the saw, and for those of our listeners who aren't gun people, the saw is a machine gun. It's a fairly large automatic weapon that a machine gun crew runs. Well, the guy that was running the saw, Joe, it ruined his life. He apologized profusely. He went public in the media, and he had to go to jail. And he lost his career in the Army. He had planned on being a career man in the Army. He had gone, if I remember, it's been 10 years since I read the book, but I think the shooter had gone to Ranger School. And so we need to remember, Benghazi is a great example. We need to remember that when these things happen, not only do we lose an RFK or a JFK or a Pat Tillman, but there are tons of other lives that are absolutely destroyed as well. Consider the supposed documentary filmmaker. Well, I guess I shouldn't say supposed. He was the documentary filmmaker of this ridiculous piece of tripe that they said instigated Benghazi. That man went to prison for a couple of years, Joe.
Yeah. It's really unfortunate what through manipulation and most importantly through death and assassination, through murder, what the government is able to get away with. And we're talking about RFK or JFK. I wonder how much different this country, if at all, it would have been today had they been able to live out their terms, live out their presidential terms, and retire after that. It's really unfortunate that, especially JFK, we did not get to see what he was able to do. And he gave one of my favorite speeches, which was the secret societies, the anti-New World Order speech. So it is a day to remember. Absolutely. If you get a chance, go check out, maybe a little couple-minute documentary and see if there's anything new that you haven't heard about the RFK assassination. All right, John, you said you want to hit some news. I'm going to toss it to you. Where do you want to start?
Well, before I do want to hit some news, and we're a little bit just past halfway point here today. And by the way, thank you, Joe. I'm glad we did a nice RFK piece today. But a good place for people to go, a good friend of the Hagmann Report, kind of a new friend, is Dark Journalist. Daniel List is his name, but he goes by Dark Journalist. You can find him on YouTube or darkjournalist.com. He has a couple of great pieces about RFK, and listeners, put on your open mind when you listen to Dark Journalist, because Daniel really does his research, but he operates in the world of dark conspiracy. So you got to go into his presentations with an open mind. But I'll tell you, Joe, you'll learn something, and we're blessed to have guests like Dark Journalist who join us. Where I want to go, and this is completely out of the blue, but our listeners seem to respond to this. I guess you could argue in some ways everybody responds to this. Alcohol companies calling for draconian police state measures to combat driving on weed. Get a load of this.
Wait. Alcohol companies?
Yep. Alcohol. I'll reread the headline. Alcohol companies calling for draconian police state measures to combat driving on weed. And this is from the Free Thought Project, written by Jack Burns, curated over at Daily Sheeple. I'll give you the first piece. The Governor's Highway Safety Association calls itself, quote, the state's voice on highway safety, end quote, and holds annual training meetings to indoctrinate, I love the way this guy writes, to indoctrinate law enforcement agencies all across the country. However, the GHSA should genuinely call itself, quote, the alcohol industry's voice, end quote, as its latest report is entirely funded by the alcohol industry and its blatant attempt to paint cannabis users as the real highway villains. Joe, I'm going to hand it back to you with this comment. I am not a big marijuana user anymore, but I have no problem telling our listeners that I used it throughout my 20s. And to be totally transparent and blunt with our listeners, Joe, I never got in an accident. I never got a point on my driving record. And the couple of times in 15 years of using that medicinal herb that I did get stopped by law enforcement for, a tail light or expired registration or whatever, I would talk to the cop, give him my license and registration. He would cite me or he wouldn't cite me, and I'd be on my way. That's how, in my opinion, this is just not the opinion of the Hagmann Report, my personal opinion, to compare driving on weed to the drunk driving crisis in this country is ludicrous.
Oh, absolutely it is. There is no comparison between the two. Obviously, marijuana can impair you, especially if you're not used to, how it makes you feel. But there is no comparison. I mean, the worst case you're going to do if you smoke too much marijuana is just get tired and fall asleep. You can't overdose from it. You don't black out. You don't lose more motor function if you continue to smoke. But it's just did you see what I put up on Hagmann Report today, John, about kratom? This fits right into what we were talking about. Kratom advocates
let's talk about that.
Fight FDA crackdown. Opponents of the Food and Drug Administration's expanding dragnet of the herbal supplement kratom are arguing that the agency is eliminating a vital way to fight the opioid crisis. Scientists and activists say that the agency's ban on kratom, which is derived from a tree leaves native to Southeast Asia, is not scientifically sound, and that the agency is taking away a tool that millions of people use to help manage pain and drug withdrawal symptoms. The FDA says there is no scientific evidence that kratom can help treat opioid withdrawal and that the herb has significant safety issues. The FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb said Friday that 44 deaths have been linked to kratom. And I think we already covered that, John. There was no such thing. But then they go on to say that they want to put it as a controlled substance Schedule 1, the same category as heroin or marijuana.
Wait a second. Now, would this have anything to do with what Pat Tillman was trying to blow the whistle on 15 years ago when he got his head deflated?
So you can't have people getting clean off of the drugs. You need them to take other drugs to stay on some kind of drug. And with kratom, you got to stay on the drugs. You got to keep Big Pharma going. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, no. I mean, it's just they don't want any natural cures out there. They don't want you to be free of the disease, of the need and necessity for medicine. So, of course, they're going to come after this. And these studies that they cite, 44 have died. If you look into that, you cannot attribute it to the kratom. So,
Joe, let's break this down a little bit. I've read now, it wasn't 44. About a year ago, it was like 33 or 37. But every single one went something like this. Joe Schmo, who had been on a 6-day drinking binge and then used kratom, died. And it's like, no, he died because 6 days in a row of binge drinking and the delirium tremens that follow that is deadly. Or it would be, Susie Smith, who had a 20 Percocet a day habit, took kratom and died. No, Susie died because her respiratory system failed because she was on 20 Percocets, Joe.
Right. That's exactly right. So this article goes on to say that in the midst of the crackdown, the American Kratom Association, a grassroots group founded in 2014, has been pushing back against the FDA and their Drug Enforcement Administration's targeting of kratom. The group said last month that the problem isn't kratom itself, but vendors that trump up health claims about herb or manufacture it irresponsibly. It goes on to say those enemies hand the FDA their daily headlines to smear legitimate kratom vendors, and they hand the FDA the weapons to demonize kratom as an unsafe plant. Now it goes on to say that grassroots groups are trying to pressure the FDA to end its crackdown on the drug, which the group estimates is used by 3 to 5 million people. It's not something that we believe we should that should be banned. It should be definitely regulated, kept to keep it safe, but it should be legal. That's from the head of that organization, Peter Candland, head of the, where was it here? The grassroots group. I can't find it.
Now,
but
don't
anyway.
forget, Joe, then don't forget the whole concept of controlled opposition. A lot of grassroots groups are formed by big pharma themselves so that they can control both sides of the narrative. I know you know this, but look, I hope this doesn't get me in trouble with the show and with the company, but I'm just going to tell people exactly what I think. I lost a brother in 2007. My stepbrother, Jared Diltz was his name. Marine Corps Private Jared Diltz. He was an active duty Marine out of Pendleton when he was training to go into force recon, and he couldn't keep up with his squad. But Joe, my stepbrother, was a 6'5" college athlete star. He played college basketball for San Jose. He could more than handle a force recon training, okay? But he couldn't keep up, and they discovered phase 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma in Jared. Jared stayed alive for 12 years from his diagnosis to when he was finally taken home. And in the last 2 years of his life, marijuana, which he grew openly in his backyard, and he was pretty good at it too, marijuana is what enabled him to I wouldn't say he won the fight, but at least he won a couple of the battles to get food into his system. He was so sick the last 12 to 18 months of his life that it was kind of strange, because my parents would be sitting there at the table, Joe, and Jared would go into his bedroom, and you could smell like the potent, pungent smell of like the skunk tail. And then he would come out and he would do his best to sit with the family. And this is heartbreaking. I mean, my stepbrother sitting next to me, and the man is literally dying. He's pale, he's gaunt, but he would sit there and he would do his best to eat with us. I'm telling you, I am convinced, I would say it right here if the Lord Jesus Christ were sitting next to me on the show. Marijuana helped him in the final 18 to 24 months of his life more than the pills did, way more. And to our listeners out there who are having, first of all, disclaimer, I am not a doctor, nor am I dispensing medical advice. This is my personal opinion as a citizen. There you go. Joe, if people are suffering chronic pain, man, don't go down the road of Oxycontin. Don't go down the road of Percodan or Vicodin. Those roads lead to nothing but a miserable addiction issue, and you'll probably wind up either in rehab or, at worst case scenario, dead. Marijuana and kratom are grown by God, and they mitigate pain. And that's, again, just my personal opinion.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and it's definitely, in my opinion, much safer than using the OxyContin. And if you have to use something like the pain medicine because the pain is so overbearing, that's fine. But if you can, try to mix it with some of that marijuana so you can take less. And that way your tolerance doesn't build, the pain medicine remains as effective, and then it doesn't affect your liver and other things as much. It's much less likely that you can or will get addicted if you have some other form of medicine to use intermittently in between the doses of pain medication. And it's so important that we make sure that we are doing whatever we can on a daily basis to take care of ourselves, because who knows, who knows when and how we all leave this earth, but we don't want to leave before we don't have to. We want to be here to stick around for the fight. But let's finish up with this article, John, and then we can move on. So the crackdown on kratom comes amid a salmonella outbreak that is linked to the product. This, according to the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, they said last month an outbreak sickened nearly 200 people. The FDA says that the herb is made from is unsafe with what it's made from. Gottlieb said in February that patent safety reports and scientific data show that kratom is not just a plant, but it is itself an opioid. Because if you remember, we read the what they said about the FDA issued a guidance, and we read it on air when we did that show about kratom. And in that document, they said that they don't know how it affects the brain, but they know that it affects the brain similarly to how the opioids does. But, John, from your own personal experience and from mine, it is nothing like opioids. Nothing like it at all.
Chemically, it's more akin. The alkaloids in kratom are more actually akin to caffeine, Joe. And I've seen some studies on this. And that's the beautiful thing about carrying the internet in your back pocket. As our guest last week, pharmacist Carl, reminded us, we've got the internet in our back pocket. So listeners, educate yourselves and don't be afraid of social stigma. We live in a world now where we're much more advanced and better studied than we were back in the days of reefer madness, And by the way, I'll say this personally, the reason I don't smoke a lot of pot, I mean, I barely ever smoke pot, frankly, but it's because the weed I smoked when I smoked in the 90s was not as potent as the weed today. But it's all relative because the people who smoke the weed today have a different tolerance structure as well. Joe, I want to drop this one on you as just almost, I don't want to say it's funny, but it's indicative of where we're at in society. This is from shtfplan.com. And it indicates, well, let me read it first and then we can talk about it. Prominent psychiatrist, quote, real victims seeking exorcisms should not be ignored, end quote. A prominent psychiatrist dealing with the world beyond is saying that not only is demonic possession very real, the victims of possession should not be brushed aside. The number of people looking for an exorcism has risen in recent years, putting more of a demand on priests and psychiatrists attempting to get help. Joe, I'm going to hand it back to you with this thought. Humans have known since before the time of Jesus that demonic possession is real. But apparently we need this article today on June 5th, 2018, and a prominent psychiatrist to tell us what they knew back in the days of Moses.
Well, yeah, John, that when I hear a headline like that, it's just very disingenuous because the people who write it don't even believe in God to begin with, from everything I can tell. And what it is just a slap in the face to Christianity to say, hey, you've lost your power. Not only have you lost your power, but the medical industry, the pharmacia, the pharmaceutical industry, and the illegal drug industry has taken the place of instead of curing spiritual ailments, you can medicate and mask the symptoms with those medications. And that's more about what it really says, I believe, than anything else, because we know that back in the day you had certain herbs and roots and whatnot, but nothing like we see today. And we were even warned about today in the pharmacia, the sorcery that would be and is used against us, and we have to make sure we do everything we can not to fall victim to that.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I hope this discussion, I hope people found the RFK thing interesting as we legitimately pay our respects to someone who maybe Joe and I don't agree with politically on every point, but go back and look at the optics of Robert Kennedy while he was campaigning in California. The man genuinely loved people. He wanted to end things, Joe. Like for example, if Robert Kennedy had become president 50 years ago, the Democrats and the left in this country might not have a race card to play. And not only that, but the 58,000 people who died in Vietnam on the American side and the couple million that died on the Vietnamese side, they might have been individuals who may have found cures for diseases or may have launched new technologies that we don't have today because they died 50 years ago in a rice paddy. And as far as the kratom and marijuana dialogue goes, I hope that there are some people out there who understand that Joe and I are Bible-believing Christians, but we're realistic about the world today. And I think you talk about disingenuous approach to these issues, Joe. I think it's very disingenuous that most pastors today will tell you, well, if you're depressed, rely on the Lord, but by all means, go get the medication you need as well. And I actually heard a pastor say that from the pulpit at my dad's church a few years back. So that's okay. If you go to CVS and you get a bottle of pills, you are okay with the church. But if you go get a bag of marijuana, I don't know what is it because you smoke it, Joe, it just seems to me like we're splitting hairs when people need legitimate help, particularly as we noted on the show last week. What was it? 40-something thousand Americans are dying a year in the opioid crisis.
60,000. 60,000. And it's funny how you said that, John. You said, the church, you're okay with the church, but in reality, you're not. You're okay with the pastor, because the pastor is the one who is telling you, yeah, it's okay. You're not going to get in trouble if you go take those pills. This is what the problem with pastors are. We should be able to pray and through discernment get an answer which is satisfactory for us, instead of relying on a priest or on a pastor. And unfortunately, that is another area where we've lost so much power. Spiritual warfare and the power of discernment is because we have allowed mediators in between us and the Lord. And many people no longer, pray individually. They expect or believe that because they attend a church that it's like their pastor is their representative for their, congregation or something. It's really weird. I don't quite get it, why people are the way they are when it comes to, their religion.
Well, I think you made a great concluding point for this, and I'll hand it back to you for a lightning round of news, Joe. But we used to live in an age of healing. Even when I was a young boy going to church in the 70s, people were healed. And I think people are still healed today. I just don't know that it's that prevalent in the American church anymore. But you go to church in South Korea, or you go to church in Venezuela or Colombia, where evangelical Christianity has exploded in the last 20 years, there are healings that occur. So is a person better off using marijuana to mitigate pain and trusting that the Lord Jesus is going to heal them in accordance to his perfect timing and will? Or is that same person better off being a slave to a doctor, a pharmacy, big pharma, and a medical insurance company who, by the way, will get you strung out, and then eventually they'll tell you, no, you can't have what we strung you out on. But they're okay with their pastor and nobody's looking down their nose at them at the church.
Yeah, it's very strange. It's a very crazy world we live in, a very hypocritical world. And, the more that we learn, the more that we see, it seems that the less we really do know, John. I mean, it is such a crazy thing to see how far we've come just since I've been an adult, how far down we have gone with this, pushing of the LGBT agenda, the homosexual agenda, the transgender agenda, on and on and on and on. It is mind-boggling. And to see, as I said last week, the media is openly on the wrong side. They're openly promoting globalism. They're openly promoting, basically the abolishment of free speech, the abolishment of Christianity, of Christians as a people. And they are the ones at the same time who are saying they're the immoral authority on truth as well as on tolerance, which is absolutely insane. But then we can see in the scriptures where it says how people will be in the end times, and it makes a lot of sense that they will kill you for my name's sake. Jesus says to Christians, they're going to kill you thinking they're doing me a service. And looking at Christians, or looking at the world today, it is very easy to see how that is and could be possible for anybody who's wondering.
I think you just laid that out beautifully with that question, Joe, and hopefully that's food for thought for our listeners. By the way, everybody, hit us up at studio@hagmanreport.com. 2 N's on Hagmann, studio@hagmanreport.com. Look, Joe and I will read your emails confidentially. We will not read them on the air unless you indicate that you would like us to. But just put in the subject line medical marijuana or kratom, or I don't know, how I deal with pain. Put something in the subject line that indicates you heard today's show and you've got a story that you'd like to share. If you want to just share it with Joe or I, indicate that in your email. If you've got something you'd like us to read on air, then we'll share your story, but we'll just use your first name, and that way you still have the anonymity that every liberty-loving American deserves.
That's right. And just real quick before we run out of time, our sponsor, simplycleanfoods.net. That's simplycleanfoods.net. Promo code simplyclean gets you a 15% discount off all items there. Check out the alt media pack. You can support us by buying food through simplycleanfoods.net and using promo code Hagmann. And also, John, I think for the rest of this week, I'm going to throw the PayPal link up there. And if anybody feels that they want to donate and they don't want to purchase or they can't afford to purchase the food to do so, just do the paypal.me/Joe Hagmann. I'll have that in the show description for today, tomorrow, and Thursday, just as an FYI, because I did get an email on my Joe Hagmann Yahoo account where somebody voiced that concern saying, well, you said don't donate here and I can't buy the food, so what am I supposed to do? So just go ahead and use the PayPal address for right now. We'll figure it out and we'll get it ironed out next week or whatever. But yeah, paypal.me/Joe Hagmann. We could really use any and all support you can give us, whether it's through Simply Clean Foods or if it's through PayPal. We really do appreciate it. Now, quick lightning round, John. As you said, you wanted to hit some news real quick here. Let's go to HagmannReport.com.
Take it away, brother.
Yeah, let's go to HagmannReport.com. There is that piece on Kratom that I mentioned. Also, there is a few other pieces up there. One, check this out. Talk about hating Christians. Huffington Post, Christians need to repent for anti-LGBT culture of death. Yes, you heard that right. No, don't you love it when the lefties lecture you about your own Christian faith, twisting the words of Christ in an attempt to guilt you out of your own moral and standards? Granted, everyone, especially Christians, should be aware of the proper charity to marginalized individuals, but when liberals preach that it is not so much about loving the sinner as it is blindly accepting the tenets of the anti-Christian agenda, it becomes clear that it is not about a level playing field. For Pride Month 2018, Huffington Post published an article, Why and How Christians Should Celebrate Pride, meaning gay pride. Well, to wary conservative Christians, it should read, repent and believe in the liberal gospel of LGBTQ politics. It goes on to say this article's main premise was that Pride Month should be a time not just when the secular population has a rip-roaring time for the gay lifestyle, but also a perfect time for Christians to celebrate the gay lifestyle too. Let me tell you something, Huffington Post. I don't even know how to say it. I would shoot myself in the head.
I just can't say it.
I would shoot myself in the head before celebrating your gay Pride Month. So keep it to yourself. Don't lecture me on my Christianity. I won't lecture you on how to celebrate, your LGBTQIACYX. How many you got more than almost half the letters. You only need the other half of the alphabet to give labels to, and
they're working on it. They're right now. Just to get it straight, it's LGBTQUACK.
I thought it was IA or AI. Okay.
Yeah, LGBT quack 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 quack, and the next. By the way, Joe, we've got Billy Crone coming up next week, and we haven't had Billy Crone on in a long time, but he's got a new book out about drones and AI technology, and it's really ominous, but in the title of the book itself, Drones and AI Technology and the Impending End of the Human Race.
Nice.
Billy
I want to
Crone
read the
coming up
UFO
next
one
week.
too.
Tonight, Stephen Minking and Stan Dale.
I want to read his UFO one too. I heard you mention that he has a book out about UFOs.
Yes. Yep. In fact, we're going to bring Billy Crone back in early July to talk about the UFO book. He will be traveling out of the country in late June, or we bring him back sooner. But yeah, Billy Crone's coming up. We've got Robert Spencer from Jihad Watch coming up, so we've got some good stuff happening.
Yep, that's going to be awesome. Well, that'll do it for us today. Until tomorrow, we'll be back. We'll be back tonight on the Hagmann Report, and then we'll be back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Have a great day, everyone.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.